Former Kansas City Police Department intelligence detective and now attorney Gary Jenkins produced 4 documentary films, most recently Gangland Wire. True stories of the mob skimming from the Las Vegas casinos in the 1970s. Creator of smartphone app entitled Kansas City Mob Tours. Download it now. Highly sought after speaker for college, corporate, and service organization programs. If you like what you hear, go to ganglandwire.com. Navigate to the shop page. We need you to put a hit out on our donate button. Buy the DVD Gangland Wire or download the Kansas City Mob Tour app. We must pay the studio time and Freedom of Information Act requests that we filed with the federal government. Follow us on Facebook at facebook.com/ganglandwire. Follow true crime storyteller Gary Jenkins on Twitter at Jenks Law. Please subscribe to this podcast and review the show. Gangland Wire True Crime Stories is produced at the Big Dumb Fun Show Studio 4. And now, here's Gary Jenkins.
I am here with my friend and co-host Aaron in the deep, dark confines of the Big Dumb Fun Show Studio. Say hello, Aaron.
Hello, Aaron.
And you can listen to Aaron and his guest on Monday nights live or as archived shows at the www.bigdumbfunshows.com. And
Big Dumb Fun Show.
Bigdumbfunshow.com. And he has another interesting thing that he's doing now. Tell the folks about that, Aaron.
It's called Sarcasm Cinema, where we get comedians together and we watch classic feature films and make fun of them. Record the audio, and then you can play it back while you're watching those same classic movies.
Sounds interesting.
We've already done Invasion of the Body Snatchers with Jeff Goldblum from the 1970s, and Jaws.
Jaws, that would be a fun one.
And Sandlot, which we haven't released Jaws or Sandlot yet, but they're going to be released here shortly. You'll find us at sarcasmcinema.com.
Cool. Okay, and if you guys out there have any feedback or suggestions for topics or just want to say hello or make a comment on my blog page, or you could email me at jinkslaw@yahoo.com, and my Twitter handle is @jinkslaw, and I'm trying to get more proficient at this twittering things and communicating with people via Twitter. And I want to mention that I asked for donations, and I want to thank Barry Parks and Michael Ledlow and Marl Watson and my friend Joe from Florida for their generous donations. And plus, I want to thank Joe for his input over the last year or so, because he asks me questions and makes me think and catches me dirty every once in a while, and because he knows his history because he lived it back in the day. So I appreciate you, Joe. One more thing before we get started. I want to make a mention of our favorite nonprofit around here, our public service announcement. We'd like to give back to the community. First Call. Make First Call your first call when you have a relative, employee, or friend with addiction problems. Call 816-361-5900 or go to www.firstcallkc.com. And they have a Facebook page. Did I sound like an announcer on that?
And their Facebook page is facebook.com/firstcallkc.
Yeah, that sounds right. I just go to Facebook and put First Call in there.
Or just go to their website.
And yeah, on their website, and you'll find it. I think they have a Twitter feed too. Okay, we have dealt with the Kansas City mob and their influence over Roy Lee Williams and the Kansas City Teamsters Union. We have dealt with the Chicago mob and Joey the Clown, Joseph Lombardo, and Alan Dorfman, and the mob's influence over the Chicago area Teamsters unions and
their pension fund.
Now, all these, I've got two more. We've got Cleveland and Milwaukee. And all these cities, their Teamsters or local Teamsters pay into the International Union, and they pay into the Central States Teamsters Pension Fund, which then would pay pensions back out to the Teamsters when they retire. In a pension fund, they get, like $800, $900, $1 billion. $1
million. Back in this would be in 1970s, 1960s,
this would probably
50s.
be. I bet this one was $100 million at least.
At least?
By the 70s. Yeah, it would have been pretty big by then.
But they have all this money that they collect from the Teamsters that they're
supposed to invest, right.
So that the Teamsters can retire and have a pension to pay for their retirement.
Correct. So let's talk about the Cleveland mob. We've talked about Chicago. We talked about Kansas City. Now Cleveland had a mob guy named Bill Presser back in the 30s, just like Red Dorfman was a contemporary of his in the 30s and 40s in Chicago. Well, there was a guy named Bill Presser, and he had a son named Jackie Presser, just like Alan Dorfman was Paul
Dorfman's son?
Paul Dorfman's son. And Bill Presser was a guy with the connections to Jimmy Hoffa, and he was the main guy in Teamsters Union in Cleveland. During the 1950s, Jackie Presser starts rising, and he becomes the international vice president of the Teamsters Union. And by the 70s, his father, Bill Presser, is under indictment for corruption charges relating to union activities. And during this time, here's what's really interesting about the Cleveland connection. Bill and his son, Jackie Presser, both agreed to become government informants to stop these charges against Bill Presser, and also to help the government keep Jimmy Hoffa from regaining any Teamsters power. See, Jimmy was out by then, was wanting to get back, and they wanted to keep Jimmy Hoffa from coming back because they now had power. Bill Presser, he saw himself as a contemporary of Roy Lee Williams, who the Kansas City mob wanted Roy Williams to be the president of the Teamsters. Well, and Chicago went along with that, but Cleveland mob, they wanted Jackie Presser to be the president of the Teamsters Union back then. And when Jimmy Hoffa disappeared in 1975, one of the people that benefited the most, I think, were the Pressers. The Pressers really felt in competition with Jimmy Hoffa and really wanted to keep Jimmy Hoffa out of there.
Well, but Roy Lee Williams was controlled by the mob in Kansas City.
Right.
And Jackie Presser, or his father, was controlled by the Cleveland.
Both the father and son were controlled by the Cleveland mob.
By the Cleveland mob.
But they all had an interest in taking care of Jimmy Hoffa because they didn't want him to come back. They had control of all these folks in there, and they didn't need Jimmy Hoffa anymore, and he disappeared. Now, during this time, again, Jackie Presser becomes what's known as a top echelon informant for the Bureau for the rest of his life. And if you remember out in Las Vegas, the FBI's got these sources all over the place that they never, ever report to anybody. They're called top echelon informants. Lefty Rosenthal, or the Robert De Niro character in Casino, was a top echelon informant, and they still won't admit that he was, and he's dead. Now, they have to admit that Jackie Presser was a top echelon informant because he ended up being indicted for adding some, he added some fake people to his union so he could get money from companies, and then he would just pocket that money, and the FBI approved of that. And then the Department of Labor came around, I believe, and then tried to indict him on it. And then he, as his part of his defense, he said, well, my FBI agent handler knew I was doing that. They approved of it. And they ended up, I think, indicting one FBI agent over this. But not him. And that's when it came out that he was actually a top echelon informant during all this time.
Well, we've had these discussions before in other episodes.
About informants and the problem with informants and them continuing to do crime and they control the officer or the agent, then protecting them, or maybe even
having to look the other way,
and maybe even assist them in doing their crime,
and being knowledgeable to the extent that they are aware of the activities.
Almost criminal culpability. Yeah, it's always a fine line. I read that line a couple times myself, and I thought, oh my God, what am I doing here? Did I tell you this story? I was in a strip club once with this informant, and And there was two other policemen there too. One of them went on to be quite high-ranking, and he never forgot what happened that night. And I think it always worried him a little bit. I think it always worried me just a little bit, but not as
now,
much
when you
as
say
it
that
did him.
the other officers, you were all
We were in a strip
not
club.
uniformed.
We're not. Oh, no, we're not uniformed. We're undercover.
Street clothes.
We're undercover, working in a strip club, and we got my informant in there, and so. He calls a gal over and talks to her, one of the strippers, and gives her some money and points out a guy, and I see her walk over to a guy in a Snap-on tool uniform, and he then says, he said, I'm going to go out in the parking lot a little bit, or I'm going outside or something like that, and I didn't think anything about it. So he goes out, and he comes back in, and he kind of laughs, and she's done with this guy in the Snap-on tool uniform by then, and he says, you see that Snap-on tool truck out in the parking lot? And I thought, oh, shit.
He just hit that truck?
He just hit it. He said there wasn't anything in it. we look at each other like, oh, my God.
Like he gave the stripper $20 to go give the guy a dance so he could go hit the car.
Exactly.
Hit
so
the
he goes see if there's a bunch of tools in there.
And you're meeting with him, and he already knows that you're a police officer.
Informants will do that to you. When you start working those professional criminal informants, they will try to implicate the officer that's dealing with them into something, so it gives them more control.
Some leverage there.
Leverage, yes. And so it's a constant kind of push back and forth to state to not let them do that. But I never did. That's probably the closest I came, I think. There might have been a couple other closer ones, but we won't talk about that. But the statute of limitations is up. But anyhow, this Jackie Presser, interesting guy. Top echelon informant, but yet a mob stooge at the same time.
Here, according to the Wikipedia there's a Wikipedia page for Jackie Presser. Mm-hmm. It says, Presser began receiving $2,500 a month, roughly $12,500 in 2007 dollars, from the FBI for providing information. Presser was considered a top echelon informant, marked him as one of the Bureau's most prized sources. Shortly thereafter, Presser allegedly received permission from two FBI agents to pad the local 507 payroll with fake employees. The individuals hired as ghost employees were not required to do any work, but nevertheless received substantial paychecks. The paychecks, it was later claimed, were a way of funneling funds to Teamsters, officials, and members of the Cleveland mob.
Sure. They even did that on The Sopranos. Ralphie on The Sopranos, he had a whole bunch of no-show jobs that they could give out to other mob guys, and they didn't have to show up. They just got a paycheck.
A paycheck would be cut for them.
Right. And another interesting thing about Jackie Presser, I probably may goes on to say that. My research revealed that he got involved in politics and in Republican politics, and he became important to the election of Ronald Reagan by influencing the Teamsters to support Ronnie Reagan with their money and their votes. He was so important to the Reagan administration that he became a member of the Reagan transition team over union affairs. Can you believe that? Jackie Presser, top echelon mob informant for the FBI, is a member of the Ronald Reagan transition team and advising them about union.
Now, when he was an informant, he was still in charge of the pension fund in Cleveland.
He was by then he was the international vice president, and he was in Chicago. He was out of Cleveland, and his basis, his people that supported him, were all Teamsters in Cleveland. But he had moved on up the ladder and was the international vice president in Chicago. Their offices are in Chicago, and which gave him a lot of say-so over the pension fund. And he was actually being backed later on by 1983 by all the Bob families, become the next president of the Teamsters, and that was after Roy Lee Williams was unable to do it. And he's the one. He ended up giving the FBI. He took care of his competition with Alan Dorfman and Roy Lee Williams in the Teamsters Union. He gave the FBI enough information to indict both of them for an attempted bribery of a Nevada Senator, Howard Cannon. They wanted some kind of trucking regulations passed, and they offered a bribe to Howard Cannon, and Cannon didn't really report it, but Presser knew about it, and he told the FBI about it, and then they went out and did an investigation. They ended up indicting both of them.
Roy Lee Williams and Alan Dorfman.
And Alan Dorfman. So
but
that takes
not
care of
Nevada Senator Howard Cannon.
No, he was a witness, I believe. He didn't take the bribe. I don't think he reported it right away. I think they had to come around and uncover it, but he did not take the bribe, so he was not indicted.
Or there was no evidence he took the bribe.
Right. And also, and later on in 1984, Jackie Presser had moved on in to be the president of the Teamsters Union, and they were the only major union to endorse Ronald Reagan for his second term. And if you remember Ronald Reagan, he was a union buster. That was his stick. That was his thing. Ronald Reagan busted the Air Traffic Controllers Union, and he was really conservative, and he started getting laws passed that restricted union activities. But still, Presser and the Teamsters endorsed Ronald Reagan for his second term. I'll never understand that one. So that's kind of the story of Jackie Presser. He ends up, he's dead now. I'm trying to remember how he ended up. We'll talk about that in a minute. The fourth of our cabal of mob-controlled Teamsters. We had Roy Lee Williams in Kansas City, we had Alan Dorfman in Chicago, and we had Jackie Presser in Cleveland, who was also controlled by the FBI. In Milwaukee, Wisconsin, they had the Ballesteri family. We had the Civella family in Kansas City, and they had the Ballesteri family, and the boss was Frank Ballesteri, and he had two sons named Joe and John Ballesteri, both of whom were lawyers, but both were involved with his mob activities. And he was also known as a mad bomber. He liked to use bombs to take people out. He was a pretty vicious guy, I understand. But the Milwaukee family was kind of, they were the lesser of all these families. They were the lesser of all the families. And I talked to an agent up there in Milwaukee named Gary Magnuson, who was one of their few organized crime agents in the entire city. They didn't pay much attention to it, and it kind of tells you. He tells a story about why just sitting around watching mob guys may be worthwhile. I used to get a lot of criticism from other policemen. Say all you do is follow those guys and watch them. You never do anything. You never arrest them. But it's very hard to build a case on organized crime members. So listen to my friend Gary Magnuson tell a little story about a discovery he made one day while following Frank Ballesteri. Play that audio, Frank Rainey.
This was a fairly unusual situation because he never left the city. He didn't like being out in the country. And I followed him one day, and he kept driving west, which turns out to be farm country. And so I followed him for some distance. He stopped at a little house, parked in front. There was one other car there. As I drove by, I wrote down the license number of the other car, and then I parked about a quarter of a mile down the road under some trees and called it in, and the office told us that it was registered to Frank Rainey. Frank Rainey was a Teamster official. He was on the board, I think, of the Teamster Central States Pension Fund. He was a trustee, I believe, and so then right away we knew that there was a connection there with the unions. We'd heard rumors of this for a long, long time, but this confirmed it absolutely, that just the two of them were there, and they were there for quite some time.
They didn't really know about this connection to the Teamsters Union by Ballesteri family until that observation that day, and during this time is when we have started the investigation, what became known as a straw man investigation, and if you want to know more about that, go get you can rent Gangland Wire at Amazon for 2 days, I think, or you could buy it on my website. But you need to watch that movie to find out more about the Skimming investigation. But this was part of the Skimming investigation because out in Nevada, this man named Alan Glick wanted to borrow money from the Teamsters pension fund, and he didn't really know anybody to borrow that kind of money from. He needed $62 million, and he got introduced to this Frank Rainey. Now, during this time, the Kansas City FBI agents had been calling Milwaukee to tell them about phone calls coming from Nick Civella to this Milwaukee boss, Ballesteri. That enabled them to go up on several phones and install some hidden microphones.
As we got into the investigation further, of course, we had wiretaps on, I think, 3 or 4 phones and a couple of microphones. And over time, we picked up conversations about the union, getting money through the union, so on and so forth. And as the investigation expanded, we determined that Frank Rainey was very much instrumental in getting the loan for Alan Glick and the Argent Corporation in Las Vegas. The Teamsters Union Central States Pension Fund financed the whole thing.
You got these 4 Teamsters in place. Alan Dorfman in Chicago, Roy Lee Williams in Kansas City, Jackie Presser in Cleveland, Frank Rainey in Milwaukee. And Alan Glick gets an introduction to Frank Ballesteri. And Frank Ballesteri says, I can do it. And but what you got to do is you have to agree to sell that casino back to me for $25,000. And he signed this is how phony this whole deal was. He signed a document, a handwritten document that said that he would sell the Argent Corporation to Frank Ballesteri for $25,000. I never did. I don't know if anybody,
even though they built it for $62 million.
Right. I don't think anybody ever understands that, why that happened or what the deal was, or why anybody thought that would be a valid piece of paper at some point in the future. But in Frank Ballesteri's mind, I guess it was, because when they served search warrants, they found that piece of paper. So, but
were they going to bring that up in court and make him turn the Argent Corporation over for $25,000?
Yeah, I can't explain it.
Do you know where Alan Glick came from to even be credible to ask him for any of this money?
Alan Glick got an introduction from a guy named, I think it was Busseri. He worked in Las Vegas, but he was connected back to the Milwaukee mob, and so he knew that the Teamsters funds, the Central States Teamsters Pension Fund, had loaned money to people to buy casinos, and Alan Glick asked for an introduction to Frank Ballesteri. Now, he claims he didn't know who Frank Ballesteri was, and so he goes to him and he tells him what he wants. He's a 32-year-old real estate developer, and the biggest thing he's done so far has been a shopping center, like a couple $1 million. He's never handled anything like this, but Ballesteri knows that this could be a good deal for them.
Because they can control
Glick. And so he then has to go to, of course, Cleveland and Kansas City and Chicago in order to get all them on board to loan Alan Glick the $62 million, which he does. And he buys the Argent Corporation, which is an acronym for his name, Alan R. Glick. Now, this corporation's flagship hotel and casino was the Stardust, and they owned the Hacienda, the Fremont, and the Marina. And they then ordered Alan Glick to hire a Chicago mob associate, Frank Lefty Rosenthal, and Lefty's job was to set up the key employees to skim money from these casinos. Now, if you saw the film Casino by Scorsese, or you saw my film Gangland Wire, then you know that story. So that's kind of I don't have a whole lot more. Frank Rainey he'd never got indicted for this. I think he probably had to be a witness. I think he was probably ran out of the Teamsters Union by the government, because the government, at the end of all this investigation...
I was going to say, what happened to all these guys?
At the end of this investigation, the government pretty well put They pretty well. They put the Teamsters Union into a trusteeship, and they appointed prominent citizens. In Kansas City, they appointed a banker named George Lear to be kind of a caretaker of the Teamsters Union while they could hold new elections and revamp themselves. As Roy Lee Williams, he was indicted out of the Skimming trial, Skimming from Las Vegas. He was indicted for attempted bribery of Howard Cannon, along with Alan Dorfman, and he ended up turning state's evidence and going. He didn't have to go into witness protection program. He testified against these mob guys, and he filled in a lot of the holes for the FBI. And he had terminal lung cancer by that time. There's some clips of him, I think, maybe online or on YouTube of him, just almost dead while he's trying to testify. So he dies shortly thereafter, after he testifies. Alan Dorfman is executed in a parking lot in Chicago because they're afraid that he's going to turn state's evidence and testify, and he really knows where all the bodies are buried. Jackie Presser goes on because he's protected by the FBI, and he ends up dying a natural death. I don't think he ever went to jail. He was indicted for those no-show jobs, but he threw so much stink up there about the FBI knowing about it and got them in trouble that he got let go on that. And Frank Rainey just kind of drifted into obscurity. He was kicked out of the Teamsters Union and probably died of natural causes. He would be dead by now. Teamsters Union never been the same since. They've never had the same power since. They
lost control of their pension fund. That was their power. Was having all of that money from those Teamsters to invest in legitimate businesses that they could then operate and skim
and make political donations and that kind of thing. So yeah, they lost a lot of power. Now they have gotten it back to a certain extent. Since then, they got all that back. It's out of trusteeship now. And they're running their own union again, but unions don't have the power they once had anyhow. So I think that's a time that will just never come again. I've talked to Teamsters over the years, and they always blame the FBI for their loss of power. They never really look at the internal corruption that created all that problems with the government.
Well, the power of the Teamsters, I thought, was their ability to negotiate with a company.
Yeah.
And do collective negotiations for the benefit of the Teamsters as opposed to providing a resource for organized crime to generate legitimate business and skim money to make other, business adventures.
Right.
That maybe would be legal or not be legal. I mean, you would say they would bring those sandwiches back from Vegas. And you were saying in the movie, they reach in one jacket pocket and pull out $40,000, and reach in the other and pull out another $40,000.
Correct. And that's kind of an interesting story there. That was the Tropicana. See, there was two streams of skim. One was from the Stardust that we just talked about. That all went to Chicago.
Each city Cleveland got a skim.
And Chicago got all the skim from the Stardust, from the Allen Glick loan, Stardust, Fremont, Hacienda, and Marina. And that money all went to Chicago, and then Chicago divvied it up back to Cleveland, Milwaukee, and Kansas City. Now, Nick Civella, on his own, set up a stream of skim coming from the Tropicana with a man named Joe Augusto and Carl Thomas. Now, how he did that was by manipulating the Teamsters loan process. Because I may have said this before. If I didn't, I'll say it now. The Teamsters made loans to casino owners to buy casinos. And it had been lucrative for them. Mm-hmm. They weren't all kickbacks to the mob. Now, probably
the casino had to service the note,
right? They had to pay,
and they were successful enough that they could do that,
right? And if they didn't, the Teamsters ended up taking over the casino and then could run it or sell it to somebody else.
Did that ever happen?
They did foreclose on some people out there, and I understand that they actually didn't lose a lot of money doing this. Mm-hmm. It was really the casinos that were losing the money. The straw men that got the Teamsters loan were running the casino for the mob,
and they were skimming so much.
They were skimming out there. They weren't making any money, but they were paying the Teamsters loan.
Yeah,
but. I started to say this other skim that Nick Civella all by himself without any help from the other mob family set up out of the Tropicana, and how he did it was they needed a loan to keep going. There's a guy named Deal Gustafson who owned it, and his partner was a woman, Mitzi Briggs, who was an heiress of some kind, and she was just in it, I think, for a lark. Probably wanted to make money, but it was probably thought it was cool to run a casino. And they needed some more operating capital, and they went to the Teamsters to get a loan. And by then, Nick Civella had a mole working there, a guy named Joe Augusto, and he told Nick about this, that they needed this Teamsters loan to keep going. And so Nick knew that he needed to put pressure on them to let Joe then show how he could help him out and get him into a place of power and position within the casino
where he could
set up the skim,
or he could skim.
So Nick goes to the Teamsters and says, "Hey, don't do this loan." So they didn't do the loan, which put them in a bad light, or put them in a bad place, because they needed the operating capital. Then Joe was going to ride in and save them. So Joe started riding in to save them, and then they, rewarded him with a higher position and gave him a lot more freedom and
once he had access and authority,
and then he got this Carl Thomas into the count rooms. And
I
Carl
thought he
Thomas
was just
set
a
up the
dishwasher.
Yeah, well, that's what he tried to tell people. I'm just a dishwasher. His official title was food and beverage manager, I think, for a while, and then he supposedly owned the Folies Bergère show and operated that on a contract basis. He owned a company that hired the girls that ran the Folies Bergère show, and then they
and from that he was able
paid him, and that gave him free run of the casino.
And he could walk into the count room?
Casino license. No, he never could. He never had a casino license. He then had enough influence to get a man named Carl Thomas, who was owned by Nick Civella, to then he was a squeaky clean on the surface casino executive, and he got the job of some kind of a manager that was high enough that he got control of the count room, and then he had 3 guys that he owned that he put in the count room, and then they were skimming the money for the Kansas City mob. Now, Kansas City didn't have to kick any money to anybody because that was all there. They set that up all by themselves, but they did kick to Chicago.
But unbeknownst to Chicago and Cleveland, they did this?
They did this without their help. Chicago probably knew about it.
I mean, at the point that they're taking skim out of one of the casinos where Chicago and all the skim went to Chicago, and they distributed it.
Yeah, from the Stardust, not from the Trop.
Not the Trop.
There was 2 streams of skim. The Trop was Kansas City's.
They own that casino.
Right. They owned the people in that casino, in the count room. These things are never simple, and all these machinations of Machiavellian kind of plans that these people do, and but the bottom line is get the money.
Well, and some of the bumper that I created for the program has Joe Augusto talking about setting up a bank for the skim because they can't just walk out of the casino with $3,000 in coins.
In coins, right. And that's where they put some people they controlled the count room where the cash was coming in. And so before it was actually counted, it's not counted at the tables.
No.
So before it's actually counted, they scraped off the top $40,000 a month, and whatever's left, they counted and put in the casino books.
And they did this for years.
And well, they did it for longer at the Stardust. They didn't do it for a whole long time at the Trop.
Because when this all occurred, that they got kind of your movie, Gangland Wire, which fell into the middle of the conversation about the scam and operations at Tropicana.
Yeah, see, this was already going when the FBI got onto it. The scam had already been going for a certain period of time from both entities. And so it's really hard to tell exactly how long it was going on. Well, you knew how long it was at the Stardust because you knew when
they bought it.
Now, the Trop, I guess you knew it had been going on for a couple of years there because Joe Augusto had been there for a couple of years. So it had been going on for a couple of years at the Stardust, too.
Well, obviously, you can rent the movie Casino, which is a fictionalized version of the events that took place, right, in Vegas.
Right.
With these characters.
Exactly. And they talk about it. And
as true as that may be, or you could actually just rent or buy Gangland Wire.
Correct.
Where you hear the voices of the men who did it.
Correct. I got all the audio tapes from the bugs and the wires that were placed in evidence for the trials of the Tropicana skim and the Stardust skim, and a lot of those are used in the movie. And I used some of them on my website to illustrate points and tell people how the mob works. I think it's important for people to know exactly how the mob works. It's like that little clip of Joey Lombardo talking about Alan belongs to Chicago. Mm-hmm. And that mob, him saying that, Alan's not that kind of guy, but the people who got a piece of him are that kind of guy. Kind of let you know that it's real. And the stuff you see in movies is based on some real actions by real people. And Joey Lombardo is a real deal killer. He's in jail for the rest of his life. All right, I think it's time that we wound this thing down. Go to www.ganglandwire.com to the shop page and make a donation. $25 will get you a Gangland Wire t-shirt. Subscribe to the podcast. And if some of you guys out there, how about reviewing the podcast? I don't think I've got any reviews yet.
Tell us what you think.
I've got some really good reviews on my app, Kansas City Mob Tours, but I don't have any reviews on the podcast. So tell me what you think. And if you have any suggestions, get hold of me. Through my website, ganglandwire.com, or my email is jenkslaw, JENKSLAW at yahoo.com, or my Twitter handle is @jenkslaw. You got any final words of wisdom?
I'd just like to make a mention to our nonprofit. First call. Make first call your first call when you have a relative, employee, or friend with an addiction problem. Call 816-361-5900 or go to www.firstcallkc.com.
Thanks, Aaron. All right. Good night, Aaron. Good night, folks.
Thank you.